long before Rome, before legions and glory. A darker power rose along the Tigris, not to build but to conquer. They were not just warriors, they were the architects of terror. This is the Assyrian Empire, ruthless, relentless, the empire that invented. In the beginning there was only the river, the Tigris, ancient and patient, carving its path through the cradle of civilization. From its waters rose a city unlike any other, Ashur. It began as a modest trading settlement, yet destiny shaped it into something far greater, a temple, a fortress, a prophecy in stone. The people of Assur believed they were chosen by their god Ashur to impose order through conquest. To them, war was not chaos. It was sacred duty. Every battle was a ritual. Every victory an offering to the divine. The first kings of Assyria were never content with mere survival. They hungered for domination, to expand beyond the horizon, to make the world bow before them. The sword is divine, they declared. The will of Ashur shall not be denied. From this belief a new kind of kingdom emerged, one where faith was forged into steel, where loyalty and terror intertwined. The children of Assur learned early, mercy was weakness, hesitation a death sentence. In this land the world would either bow or burn. At the heart of the Assyrian Empire stood Ashur, the sacred city, the throne of gods and kings. Its walls were built not just from stone but from faith and fear. The people believed Ashur was more than a god. He was the very spirit of conquest, the divine breath that filled their armies with relentless purpose. Inside the great temple, the air was thick with smoke and heavy silence. Priests whispered the names of enemies yet to fall, their prayers rising with the scent of burning cedar. Kings entered barefoot, heads bowed, eyes burning with ambition. They did not seek peace. They demanded victory, and in return, Ashur granted them power, the power to rule, to destroy, to shape destiny with the blade. For every soldier, war was a sacred act. Arrows were prayers, chariots thunder-made flesh. When the armies marched from the gates of Ashur, the earth itself seemed to tremble, as if acknowledging the blood that would soon be spilled in the name of a god. In Ashur, faith was forged into steel, and steel became the language of empire. While other kingdoms fought with chaos and passion, the Assyrians fought with order. Their army was not a mere gathering of men. It was a machine, precise and relentless. For the first time in history, war became science. Soldiers were trained from youth, organized by rank, divided by skill, infantry, archers, charioteers, engineers. Each man knew his place. Each weapon had purpose. When the army advanced, it moved like a single heartbeat, step by step, shield by shield, an unstoppable rhythm of death. They built siege towers that crawled like beasts of wood and flame. They crossed rivers on floating skins, inflated goat bladders carrying warriors silently through black waters. And when they reached the walls of their enemies, they did not shout for glory. They waited, patient, precise. Then, like thunder breaking the sky, the Assyrian war machine struck with terrifying perfection. Every arrow, every charge, every siege was a message. Resistance was futile. In their hands, fear became discipline, and discipline became divine. The Assyrians discovered a truth no empire before them had grasped. Victory alone was not enough. Fear was the ultimate weapon. When their armies laid siege to a city, they moved like wolves, circling their prey with patience and precision. They cut off the water, blocked the gates, let hunger and dread do what swords alone could not. And when the walls finally fell, they made a statement, a lesson in defiance. Captured kings were chained like animals, paraded before their people as living warnings. Some were flayed alive, their skins nailed to the city gates, messages written in blood for all to see. Entire populations were uprooted, forced to march across deserts to unfamiliar lands. To the Assyrians, terror was not cruelty. It was order, a language even silence could understand. As city after city burned beneath their banners, whispers spread across the ancient world. The armies of Ashur are coming. For the Assyrians, to rule through fear was to rule forever. And in their hands, fear became an instrument of empire. From the blood-soaked plains of Mesopotamia rose a man who would redefine what it meant to rule. His name was Ashurnasirpal II, King of Kings chosen by Ashur, the architect of an empire forged in terror. To his people, he was the living voice of a god. To his enemies he was a shadow that blotted out the sun. He waged wars not for survival, but for spectacle. His armies marched from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Mediterranean, leaving behind cities rebuilt in his image, and others erased from existence. In his royal inscriptions, he boasted without remorse, "I built pillars of skulls. I burned their cities. I filled their rivers with blood." Yet in the same breath he built the great city of Kalhu, a jewel of architecture, a palace of gold and ivory, where walls breathed with the carved memories of conquest. Lion hunts became royal ceremonies, symbols of divine power. Each arrow loosed was a reminder that even nature bowed to Assyria's king. The people celebrated him as both god and butcher, a ruler who believed beauty and terror were carved from the same stone. In Satyatita Ashur-Nasirpal's reign, fear became a monument, carved into the bones of empires. On the bones of fallen cities, Ashur-Nasirpal II built his masterpiece, the city of Kalhu. It was not merely a capital, it was a declaration, a statement to gods and mortals alike. Assyria is eternal. The walls stretched for miles, their gates guarded by lamassu, hybrid beasts of man, lion, and eagle, carved to frighten spirits and awe the living. Inside, golden palaces glittered under the blazing Mesopotamian sun. Every stone slab told a story, of kings victorious, of enemies crushed, of rivers dyed red with conquest, yet beneath this splendor lay endless suffering. Tens of thousands of captives labored in silence, their blood mixed into the mortar that held Kalhu's walls together. The city shone like a jewel, but its foundations whispered in pain. Courtiers bowed before the king. Musicians played beneath murals of slaughter. Banquets overflowed with wine and roasted lamb, all while the scent of burning incense failed to hide the stench of death drifting from the dungeons below. Kalhu was paradise built from torment, a city that reflected its ruler's soul, glorious, divine, and merciless. Kalhu glittered like the sun, but every ray of gold hid a shadow of blood. To understand the Assyrian Empire, one must first understand Ashur. He was not merely a god, he was the embodiment of destiny itself. Every king of Assyria was his chosen vessel, anointed in sacred oil, their names inscribed beside divine symbols, their swords blessed with holy flame. To fight for the king was to fight for Ashur. To die for him was to ascend among the stars. The Assyrian kings ruled with absolute conviction. They did not see conquest as greed, but as sacred duty. Each campaign began not with a battle cry, but with a prayer. In the great temple of Ashur, incense rose like the souls of the fallen. Priests read omens in the flight of birds, in the blood of sacrificed bulls, in the flicker of sacred fire. When the signs favored war, the king stood before his army, draped in gold and lion hide, and proclaimed, "Ashur commands it." And so thousands marched, not as men, but as instruments of a god whose mercy had no place in the world of mortals. From that belief flowed an empire unstoppable, one that crushed nations not only with weapons, but with divine certainty. To the Assyrians, war was not conquest, it was worship. The Assyrians were not merely warriors, they were engineers of war, architects of destruction. Their brilliance in siegecraft transformed conquest into a science, where walls were not protection, but puzzles to be broken. From the towering fortresses of the Hittites to the walled cities of Elam, no stronghold could withstand their methodical fury. Their armies carried with them instruments of terror, siege ramps taller than towers, battering rams reinforced with iron, and sappers tunneling beneath walls to bring them crashing down. Imagine the sound, the rhythmic pounding of the ram, echoing like thunder against stone, the hiss of flaming arrows streaking across the sky, the screams of defenders as walls shuddered under relentless force. Assyrian soldiers marched in perfect discipline, shields locked like iron walls, while engineers shouted commands, adjusting ropes, fire, and momentum. They did not fight for glory, they fought for control. They turned warfare into theater, a symphony of unstoppable momentum. In palaces at Nineveh and Nimrud, they carved their victories into stone reliefs, battering rams, ladders, chaos immortalized for eternity. Not just war, but mastery over it. They were not driven by mercy. They were driven by purpose, to show that resistance to Assyria was not courage, it was folly. In the hands of the Assyrians, Every wall was a challenge, every city a stage, and every victory a message. Fear is the language of empire. Every empire needs a god to justify its power. For the Assyrians, that god was Asher, the divine embodiment of conquest itself. Not a god of peace nor of harvest, but a god of dominion, the will to rule, the right to destroy, and the duty to expand. In the city of Asher, perched on the banks of the Tigris, his great ziggurat soared like a stairway to heaven, shimmering under the desert sun. From this sacred pinnacle, kings received their divine mandate, to bring the world under Assyria's order. Every campaign, every conquest, every life taken, all were offerings to Asher. When the king marched to war, he did not go as a mere ruler. He went as the chosen hand of Asher himself. Priests burned incense, their smoke curling like divine judgment, reciting hymns not for mercy but for victory. Drums thundered in rhythm with the heartbeat of the god, and soldiers advanced with sacred fury, believing that to fall in battle was to join Asher's eternal army. Royal inscriptions echoed this unyielding faith. By the command of Asher, I destroyed their cities. I left their lands empty, and their people I carried away. To the Assyrians, conquest was not cruelty, it was obedience. The world was chaos, and Asher demanded order. The cult of Asher transformed war into worship, and empire into destiny. It did not just give the Assyrians the means to conquer. It gave them the divine conviction that conquest was sacred. Asher's hand guided every blade, every arrow, every soldier, the god of war walking among mortals. After centuries of conquest, the Assyrian Empire teetered on the edge of unrest. Rebellions simmered, internal strife threatened stability, and the specter of stagnation loomed. It was then that Tiglath-Pileser III emerged, a king like no other, a master of reform, war, and fear. He transformed Assyria into a machine of unstoppable power. Tiglath-Pileser reorganized the military, creating a standing army, ready to strike anywhere at a moment's notice. Campaigns were no longer seasonal. Speed and precision became the new law of the battlefield. Archers, cavalry, and chariots moved in coordinated waves, crushing kingdoms that once thought themselves secure behind walls. But his genius extended beyond war. He centralized authority, placing provinces under loyal governors and systematically removing resistant rulers. Rebellion met swift and absolute punishment, deportations, executions, and public demonstrations of terror. Fear became a methodical tool of control, spreading across the known world like wildfire. In his inscriptions, Tiglath-Pileser III proclaimed with pride, "I conquered lands far and wide." Their kings trembled, their people were scattered. Asher granted me dominion over all. Under his reign, the empire expanded farther than ever before, reaching into Syria, Babylonia, and beyond. Cities that resisted were razed to the ground. Those that submitted became part of a vast system of loyalty, tribute, and fear. Every campaign, every conquest, every execution reinforced a single truth. Conquest was sacred duty, and terror was governance. Tiglath-Pileser III did not inherit an empire. He rebuilt it, stronger, faster, deadlier than ever. In his hands, fear became policy and power became absolute. In the age of Tiglath-Pileser III, the shadow of Assyria stretched farther than ever, and the world learned to tremble. The power of the Assyrian Empire was not measured merely by the lands it held, but by the fear it instilled. To maintain dominion, they perfected methods of terror that echoed for generations. Their enemies were not simply defeated, they were erased, humiliated, and reshaped according to Assyrian will. Captives were deported en masse, uprooted from their homelands, forced to march hundreds of miles to unfamiliar lands. Families were torn apart, cities emptied, cultures dismantled, all in the name of absolute control. Resistance was punished with unimaginable cruelty, impalement, flaying, and public executions. These atrocities were carved into stone reliefs, not vanity, but warnings etched in blood for all who dared defy them. Psychological warfare was as deadly as physical destruction. Messengers spread tales of Assyrian brutality long before the army arrived, and many cities surrendered, without a single arrow fired. Those who doubted soon learned that defying Assyria was folly. Even kings trembled at the thought of facing their disciplined, merciless forces. In this empire, fear was more than a weapon. It was a language. Every conquered nation learned the same lesson. Survival was impossible without submission. Assyria ruled not just with armies, but with the shadow of fear, a shadow that stretched across the ancient world. The Assyrians were not just masters of fear and strategy, they were innovators of war. Their armies wielded weapons that combined craftsmanship, brutality, and psychological power. Every tool was designed to dominate, intimidate, and annihilate. The composite bow, smaller yet more powerful than any before, allowed archers to pierce armor at incredible distances. Trained from childhood, these soldiers mastered its deadly curve, releasing volleys that could shatter enemy formations long before they reached the gates. Chariots, adorned with spikes and bronze reinforcements, thundered across the plains like lightning, crushing foot soldiers and scattering entire armies in their path. Assyrian ingenuity extended to siege machines centuries ahead of their time. Towering siege towers, iron-reinforced battering rams, and pontoon bridges that carried troops across rivers with startling efficiency. What was once thought impossible, breaching the most fortified cities, became routine victories. Every weapon was more than metal or wood. It was a symbol of dominance, a psychological hammer. Their enemies did not simply face defeat. They faced total annihilation at the hands of Assyria's engineers and artisans of terror. In the hands of Assyria, every weapon became a message: submit or be destroyed. At its zenith, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Egypt. A realm forged in fire and fear, bound together by iron, blood, and the divine mandate of Ashur. Yet even the mightiest empires are not eternal. The seeds of decline were hidden within its own strength. Endless warfare drained its resources, constant campaigns overextended armies, and fractured loyalty among provincial governors. Fear that once unified began to breed resentment. Cities terrorized into obedience now conspired in secret, waiting for weakness to strike. External enemies grew bolder. The Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians, once distant and cautious, sensed opportunity. United against a common oppressor, they struck with precision. Cities of Nineveh, Calhu, and Ashur, symbols of invincibility, burned. Statues toppled, ziggurats crumbled, and the roar of conquest faded into silence. Yet even in collapse, Assyria's legacy endured. Its innovations in warfare, administration, and terror would influence empires for centuries. They had built not just a kingdom of fear, but a blueprint of imperial power, a shadow that would haunt history forever. Empires may fall, but the shadow of Assyria, ruthless, brilliant, and terrifying, would never be forgotten. Though the walls of Nineveh have long crumbled, and the roar of chariots has faded into legend, the shadow of Assyria endures. Their empire was not merely a chapter in history. It was a lesson in power, discipline, and terror, etched into the consciousness of the ancient world. Assyria's innovations in warfare, from the composite bow to siege engines and professional armies, shaped the strategies of empires for centuries. Their methods of psychological control, deportation, and public displays of power influenced kings and generals far beyond Mesopotamia, leaving a blueprint for how terror could be wielded as a tool of governance. Beyond the battlefield, their administrative systems and monumental architecture inspired civilizations that followed. The cities of Ashur, Calhu, and Nineveh were more than capitals. They were statements of ambition, faith, and control. Reliefs of winged bulls, lions, and kings still whisper the stories of a people who believed that fear could command loyalty as effectively as love. Assyria's empire may have fallen, but its mark is eternal. It reminds us that the machinery of fear can build empires, influence generations, and leave a legacy more enduring than gold or stone. The Assyrians conquered with steel and terror, but they left behind a legacy that still teaches the world the art of power.